Welcome back to the deep dive. Our listeners, you guys are the kind of folks who want to go beyond the headlines, right? You want to really grasp the nuances of history. And that's what we're all about. Today we're tackling the formative years of modern Singapore, focusing on its first prime minister, Lee Kuan Yew.
This is a fascinating story of adaptation and learning. We'll be using Lee Kuan Yew's memoirs, The Singapore Story. It gives us this incredible firsthand view of his thought processes.
Right, it's like having a direct line to his thinking. So what we want to understand is how Lee Kuan Yew used these experiences, some pretty traumatic, like the Japanese occupation.
Yeah.
How did he use all of that to shape Singapore's political landscape? How did he ensure that the People's Action Party, the PAP, would become so dominant, especially against the communist challenge? And of course, we'll look at the struggle for independence from Malaysia and those initial elections that really set the stage.
Exactly. It's about understanding the how and the why behind his strategies.
Okay, so let's start with something that deeply impacted both Singapore and Lee Kuan Yew, the Japanese occupation. This was from 1942 to 1945. This wasn't just a period of hardship, it was a complete upheaval of everything they knew.
Absolutely. The Singapore story really brings this period to life. I mean, Lee Kuan Yew talks about the constant fear, the brutality of the Japanese military was just shocking. He even describes, I think it was the stench of unwashed soldiers, the humiliation of being slapped if you didn't understand something fast enough. So this personal experience of vulnerability mixed with the sudden collapse of, well, the British Empire, which had seemed so powerful, it really changed his whole worldview.
And it wasn't just personal experiences either. The atrocities were on a massive scale. Take the Sup Ching massacre. It was the systematic killing of young Chinese men, and the estimated death toll in his memoirs. It's just staggering, like 50,000 to 100,000. It's difficult to even comprehend the impact of witnessing that kind of widespread violence, the complete breakdown of law and order. How does that shape your thinking about governance, about security?
It's a turning point, for sure. It really shattered this idea of Western invincibility. In fact, Lee Kuan Yew recalls his reaction when he saw a huge explosion during the Japanese invasion. He said, and I quote, "That's the end of the British Empire." His principal at Raffles College, Professor Dyer, who is a pretty experienced observer of these things, didn't even disagree. And then there are the stories of British officials fleeing Penang in the middle of the night. I mean, imagine seeing the people you thought were in control running away like that. It completely eroded the local population's respect for them, for the colonial power, and it exposed their weaknesses.
But this is where Lee Kuan Yew's pragmatism really kicks in. It's not just about being traumatized. He actually adapts to this new reality. English became practically useless under Japanese rule, so he started learning Mandarin out of necessity. He even bought a textbook called Mandarin Made Easy. He had this incredible ability to learn and adjust even in a totally transformed environment.
It's pretty remarkable. And you see it again when he talks about the Japanese military administration. He actually acknowledges that they were effective at maintaining order. Think about it. There was widespread deprivation. Things were really tough. But crime rates were surprisingly low. He directly attributes this to the fact that punishments were severe and swift. He mentions that people felt safe leaving their doors unlocked. And he's explicit in his memoirs about how this experience influenced his own later stance on law and order. He was very skeptical of what he called a soft approach to crime. So there's this direct line between his observation during the war and the policies he implemented later on.
It's almost like he was mentally filing away these notes. Okay, this system works, this one doesn't. Regardless of the morality of it. He also worked at Hodobu, the Japanese propaganda department. That must have been a really strange experience being surrounded by this fabricated pro-Japanese narrative when he knew what was really happening in the war. Do you think that shaped his understanding of information and how it could be used, how powerful it could be?
I think that experience at Hodobu definitely gave him a firsthand look at how information could be manipulated, how effective propaganda could be. Being immersed in a world that's basically constructed while knowing the truth, it probably made him very aware of how narratives are controlled, how they're shaped. And that's a lesson that would have been incredibly relevant later on in his political career. Especially when he was dealing with his own adversaries, it shows that he could take practical lessons from situations that were, morally speaking, quite compromising.
Let's move on to the post-war period. Singapore is a changed place. Lee Kuan Yew returns, and it's not long before he marries Kwa Geok Cho. She was brilliant, shared his intellectual and political interests. They actually kept their marriage secret for almost 3 years before having a public ceremony, which I think speaks to their independent spirit. This partnership seems incredibly important to his story.
Oh, absolutely. They were intellectually very much in sync. Both were top graduates of Raffles College. And this shared passion for politics led them to study law at Cambridge, where they started the Malayan Forum with other like-minded individuals, people like Go Keng Swee, Tochin Chai. It's important to remember that the Malayan Forum was this non-communist, anti-colonial voice. They were advocating for a unified Malaya that included Singapore. So this is really where their political ideology starts to take shape.
While they were in post-war Britain, they saw democratic socialism being put into practice, things like the creation of the National Health Service under Nguyen Bevan. How much do you think this exposure to social welfare programs influenced their vision for Singapore?
I think seeing those democratic socialist principles being applied in real life in Britain gave them a concrete model for how to address social inequality. It showed them how a government could provide for the welfare of its citizens. And this undoubtedly influenced the PABI's focus on social development in Singapore, things like public housing, healthcare, it's all there.
And at the same time, back in Singapore, Lee Kuan Yew's getting involved in trade union disputes. The postman strike was a big one. This is him starting to use political strategy to challenge the colonial administration. What do you see as the key takeaway from this early activism?
You see a real evolution in their demands during that postman strike. At first, they were focused on getting allowances for the senior officers. But Lee Kuan Yew and his colleagues, they shifted the focus. They started advocating for proportional allowances for all government servants, especially those who were lower paid. So you already see this understanding of the power of mobilizing the masses, this focus on social equity. It's not just about a small group of elites anymore.
And this leads us to a huge challenge, the rise of communism in Singapore.
Yeah.
It seems Lee Kuan Yew underestimated their influence at first, especially within the Chinese educated community and the trade unions, which were very powerful. He even admitted later that he'd regretted his initial assessment. He downplayed communist activity in Chinese schools. Why do you think this was such a blind spot for him?
I think there was a real disconnect between the English-educated elite, which is where Lee Kuan Yew came from, and the Chinese-educated community, who mostly spoke Mandarin. This community had its own schools, its own culture, its own political leanings, and the colonial government and the English-educated folks, they often ignored them. So it created this space where communist ideology could take hold and thrive, which Lee Kuan Yew and his peers, they didn't fully grasp at first.
It's surprising then that the PAP, with its largely English-educated leadership, formed a united front with the communists. We're talking about figures like Lim Chin Siang, Feng Shui Suan. What was the strategic thinking behind this alliance?
In his memoirs, he actually mentions that his initial impression of them was positive, that they were well-mannered, sincere. It seems paradoxical, but this alliance was a really pragmatic move. The PIP needed to connect with the Chinese-speaking working class, who were largely under communist influence. They needed that broad base to push for independence. The communists, on the other hand, they saw the PIP as a way to advance their own agenda. It was a tactical alliance. A marriage of convenience, really. They needed each other to achieve this immediate goal of self-governance, even though their long-term visions were completely different.
It must have been tricky navigating that alliance. Pretty soon, the PAP leadership realized the communists wanted to take over the whole movement. They started using by-elections, like the one in Tanjong Pagar, to solidify their control. Then they tightened up the party's constitutional controls. What kind of specific measures did they take, and why were they so important?
The changes to the PIP's constitution were about making sure that the party leadership had the final say, preventing any one faction, like the communists, from grabbing control. They changed rules around membership, how decisions were made, things like that. It was preemptive, really. They recognized that the United Front was inherently unstable, and they knew the communists were ambitious. They wanted total control. So this was about safeguarding the PAP's non-communist identity, making sure it stayed on course.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit and talk about the road to self-government and that ultimately short-lived merger with Malaysia. Lee Kuan Yew was dealing with figures like David Marshall and the Labor Front, who were kind of fluid in their stance on independence. He even blocked some of Marshall's resolutions. What was his game plan there?
Marshall was a captivating speaker. He was great at advocating for independence, but he may not have had that long-term strategic thinking that Lee Kuan Yew had. Lee Kuan Yew probably blocked those resolutions as a tactic. He wanted to keep control of the narrative, make sure the path to independence aligned with the PIP's vision, which included merging with Malaya as a key step. And the failure of that all-party committee on Chinese schools, even though they'd reached a compromise, it just shows how complicated the social and political landscape was back then.
Those London constitutional talks were a turning point. It became clear that Britain was prioritizing an independent Malaya with Malay leadership. Singapore's future was a bit up in the air. They might end up self-governing, but not fully independent. How did this realization change the PIP's approach?
I think it forced them to really rethink their strategy. They realized that Britain was determined to grant independence to Malaya, and Singapore, on its own, while its security and long-term viability were questionable, that's when the idea of merging with Malaya really came to the forefront. It was a way to achieve genuine independence for Singapore, though within a federation. It was seen as the most realistic path forward.
But before they could even think seriously about merging, there were internal problems to deal with, specifically the flushing out of pro-communists from within the PIP itself. Lim Yu Hok's actions and the PIP's efforts to clear their name, those were big events. Why was this internal purge so important?
This was an existential threat for the PIP. To be seen as a credible alternative to the communists, to gain the trust of potential allies in Malaya, like the non-communist elements there, they had to break with their communist allies, and decisively. Lim Yu Hok's government cracked down, and the PP needed to distance themselves from the communists to gain legitimacy, to pave the way for a merger on their own terms. And you see this strategic realignment even more clearly when they form an electoral pact with UMNO, the big Malay political party in Malaya, and the Labour Front. They did this for the 1957 city council elections to defeat the Liberal Socialists. It's a big shift.
Let's talk about Kuan. He was the mayor of Singapore. He started out with a lot of popular support, but the PAP eventually started to worry about mismanagement and the possibility of communist influence. They ended up dismantling his authority. What does this tell us about the PAP's approach to governance?
The whole Kuan episode shows how focused the PAP was on maintaining control, on ensuring things were run efficiently. They put up with his populist appeal for a while, but the second they saw signs of mismanagement, potential links to communists, it was a threat to their vision of a stable Singapore. They were willing to act, even against someone popular, to keep their hold on power and achieve their goals.
The 1959 general election was a major victory for the PAP. Their campaign was incredibly well organized, they had diverse candidates, and Lee Kuan Yew himself made a real effort to connect with different language groups. He even learned some Hokkien. And that symbolic white attire, that was a powerful image. What do you think was the significance of all these elements?
The 1959 campaign was brilliant. Having candidates from different ethnicities, different language backgrounds, it signaled their commitment to a truly multiracial and multilingual Singapore. And Lee Kuan Yew, learning Hokkien, the main Chinese dialect, it showed how determined he was to reach out to the majority of the population. The white attire, it symbolized a clean slate, a break from the corruption of the colonial era and previous administrations. It was all about projecting this image of unity, integrity, and competence.
And then, even before they officially took office, Lee Kuan Yew negotiated with the British to get pro-communist detainees released. This seems counterintuitive, doesn't it? What was the logic there?
It was a calculated risk. They needed to keep some credibility with their Chinese-speaking base, many of whom had supported the United Front with the communists. By getting them released, they showed that they hadn't completely abandoned their former allies. It was about managing the split, minimizing any potential backlash. It was a balancing act, for sure, trying to assert their own non-communist identity while still maintaining popular support.
Let's dive into the merger with Malaysia. It didn't last, but it was complex. The PAP's core belief was that Singapore couldn't be truly independent without merging with a democratic, socialist, non-communist Malaya. Why was that merger seen as so essential?
To the PAP, the merger was about survival. Singapore was small, it had limited resources, and they saw it as incredibly vulnerable on its own, both economically and politically. Merging with Malaya offered economic integration, a stronger defense system, and a shared political future. It was the most viable way to achieve real, lasting independence.
But the Tunku, the Prime Minister of Malaya, wasn't initially keen on the merger. He was worried about Singapore's largely Chinese population. Lee Kuan Yew really had to work at building that relationship with the Tunku. He used personal connections, he presented himself as Malayan-minded, he even made an effort to speak Malay with the Tunku and his wife. How important were these personal efforts?
They were critical. The Tunku was hesitant, so building that trust, that rapport, was key to convincing him. By demonstrating a commitment to a shared future and addressing those concerns about the racial balance, Lee Kuan Yew managed to make the merger a real possibility.
The PAP also used public broadcasts very strategically to expose what the communists were doing, to justify their split with the party, and to prepare the ground for the merger. And the 1962 referendum on merger, even though the Bersand Socialistes were strongly against it, showed that there was significant support among Singaporeans. What do you think was the key to getting that public endorsement?
Those public broadcasts were huge in shaping public opinion and isolating the communist opposition to the merger. The referendum campaign, it was all about reassuring people, telling them about their rights, the benefits of joining Malaysia, and they really hammered home the dangers of the communist alternative. It was a clear message, and it worked. They emphasized protecting citizens' interests, and that was key to getting that strong mandate for merger. Lee Kuan Yew even went to the United Nations to make Singapore's case. He wanted that international support.
So the merger happens in 1963, and things are looking good, but then tensions start to rise with UMNO leaders.
Yeah.
Figures like Syed Jafar Albar were fanning the flames, and communal politics were getting worse. The Malaysia campaign, which advocated for equality for all races, it really added fuel to the fire. Why was this campaign so divisive?
The Malaysia campaign was about equality, which is a fundamental principle, but it directly challenged the power structure in Malaysia, which was based on Malay dominance. It was this clash of ideologies, this power struggle that caused so much friction. In the end, it made the federation impossible to sustain. Lee Kuan Yew's speeches in the Malaysian parliament, they were powerful. He articulated his vision for a truly inclusive Malaysia, but some in the UMNO leadership saw them as a direct attack.
All this tension eventually leads to the Tunku deciding that Singapore had to leave Malaysia. This is 1965. What were the circumstances surrounding that decision? What happened?
The communal tensions were just escalating. The political differences were irreconcilable. The friction between the federal government and the Singapore state government was constant. The Tunku realized that the merger wasn't working anymore, that it was causing more harm than good. The decision for Singapore to leave was made pretty quickly. It was a lot of behind-the-scenes negotiations between the Tunku, his deputy Razak, and Lee Kuan Yew hammering out the terms of the separation.
Those negotiations were fast, weren't they? What were Lee Kuan Yew's priorities during those discussions?
Security was paramount. This was especially important given that the communist threat was still very real. He got assurances from key figures, like Bogars, about Singapore's safety. Another key priority was securing essential resources, particularly water. This led to that water agreement with Johor being included in the separation documents. And we can't forget the emotional aspect of all this. Many of the ministers, they'd been born in Malaya. This separation, it was a personal loss for them. It shows the human cost of these political decisions.
The simultaneous announcement of Singapore's independence in both Singapore and the Malaysian parliament, it's a defining moment. Singapore was independent, and it was unexpected.
A momentous occasion. Singapore thrust into independence, facing an uncertain future. But they had a leadership that had been through a lot and had learned from those experiences.
So we've reached the end of our deep dive. And it's clear that Lee Kuan Yew was a pragmatic leader. He could learn, he could adapt, and he did it based on a wide range of experiences. The brutality of the Japanese occupation taught him about the fragility of power, the need for order. His time in Britain exposed him to social justice, the role of government in providing for its people. His time dealing with the communists, that was a lesson in grassroots mobilization, and it reinforced the need for ideological clarity. Even the failed merger with Malaysia, that taught him about navigating complex political relationships, about self-reliance.
What's striking is how many different things he drew upon to form his thinking. And this brings up an interesting question for you, our listener, to consider. How do individuals and nations learn and adapt? It's not always obvious. Think about how all these different experiences, the good and the bad, they can shape strategic thinking. They can change the course of history. What unexpected lessons are being learned right now, that will have a big impact on the world in the future.
Food for thought, right? Thanks for joining us on The Deep Dive.